Okay, it's 1 o'clock. We have a lot of attendees already here. So first of all, thank you all for coming to the second part of our webinar series, Ward Laboratories Educational Series, Producing Robust Livestock Through Nutrition, Genetic, and Soil Health Management. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Woody Lane. He will be presenting Grazing Quality Forages and Practical Soil Health. First, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. First of all, each webinar in this series is worth 1 continuing education credit for all American Registry of Professional Animal Scientists. So if that's something you need to take care of, go ahead and make sure you get that. Second, if you attend all 4 of our webinars, so if you've attended the first one with Dr. Vanderlei and this one, make sure you attend the next 2 webinars and you'll be eligible for one free NIR and mineral forage analysis and some ward gear. All of our questions today will go through the Zoom chat and the Q&A, and Dr. Lane has been gracious enough to say no matter how long his presentation takes, he's going to spend 15 minutes or so answering your guys' questions, and if we don't get through them all, because he said that he's got a lot of information for us today, we will make sure we follow up with you via email. And finally, if you have to get off early, all of our webinars are going to be recorded, and so you can find them at the Ward Labs YouTube page. So I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Woody Lane. He is a nationally known expert on pasture management, sheep and beef cattle nutrition, and grazing techniques. His passion for sharing his knowledge comes across in all he does, including his writing. Lay people who have read his work on forages say they never look at a field the same way again. Dr. Lane has published 2 books, a book on forages, grazing, and soils entitled Capturing Sunlight, Book 1, Skills and Ideas for Intensive Grazing, Sustainable Pastures, Healthy Soils, and Grass-Fed Livestock, and a book on livestock nutrition entitled From the Feed Trough, Essays and Insights on Livestock Nutrition in a Complex World. He has published hundreds of popular articles and fact sheets on cattle and sheep production and grazing. And he has also written more than 25 research articles in peer-reviewed scientific journals. Woody earned his PhD and master's degrees in animal nutrition from Cornell University. He is now the owner and operator of Lane Livestock Service, an independent consulting firm based in Roseburg, Oregon. Woody has often been featured in many of the top workshops and conferences across the United States and Canada. He also teaches practical courses on forage management and livestock nutrition, and he facilitates 3 innovative forage discussion groups for farmers and ranchers in Oregon. He worked on the famous Allegheny Highlands project in West Virginia from 1978 to 1980 and was on the faculty at the University of Wisconsin as the state sheep extension and beef cattle specialist in the 1980s. He has made his home in Oregon since 1990. So, Dr. Lane, if you'd like to share your screen, I will go ahead and let you get to it.
Well, thank you, Becca, for the introduction, and thank you to Ward Lab to setting this up. And it's going to take me a moment to get everything squared away here. That in terms of sharing the screen and doing what I need to do to make this actually work. Okay, I hope everyone can see this. You can raise your hand if you can't. Working in a webinar setting online is a whole different thing than standing in front of folks with a whiteboard. But we will do this today, and I have a lot to cover. And the idea here is we're really focusing on quality forages, or quality forages and practical soil health, as the title says. But I will be it'll be almost a potpourri of a series of different things really quickly to give you some very solid principles about what we're doing and why we're doing it. We're going to talk a little bit about forage growth and pastures and some basic principles of what's going on, and then how do you graze, or how do you work with quality forages and keep them quality while you're grazing, while the animals are grazing. We're going to talk a little bit about reading forage test reports, some basic things that will be helpful. We'll move to some soil tests, and at the very end, and how that we use that in a very practical way. And I know people do soil tests. They've heard about them for years and years and years. It's kind of like asparagus is good for you. You want to take a soil test? Well, it's more complex than that and more useful than you'll see. And then we get a little bit of time. I want to cover a very interesting field situation that occurred that uses the information that we get from tests. So we've got a long way to go. And this, by the way, for those people who are not in Oregon, this is Eastern Oregon. Oregon is not always deep green, lots of rain, high trees and big trees and all that. This is the other part of the state, which is 2/3 of the state, an area where you better have a full tank of gas before you embark on this road. In any case, let's do this. Forage quality. And this is a basic principle of forage growth in terms of your pastures. On the y-axis is the TDN, or total digestible nutrients. That's the energy value of the feed, of the forage. And then is the x-axis is the time going from spring to summer. So how do forages grow in the sense of their quality is first cut goes like this. And I apologize because I tried to figure out how to use PowerPoint to set it up so that this is kind of a curve and goes down, and so that it actually follows biological what happens. I don't have the skills to do anything except do straight lines. So there really is not an angle here. It's a curve. But the end result is it starts out in the early spring or late winter. Whenever the forages start to grow, they're extremely high quality. You're going to have 75%, 70% TDN. And then as the forages mature, the energy value of the feed goes down as the plants lignify and the fiber level increases, and that fiber becomes less and less digestible. And as the plants also are going to seed, and they come down, and eventually you cut down here, and what happens is they might be high up here. By the time you get down here, if people are they're first cutting hay and making 4th of July hay, they're using a chainsaw to be able to make that cut. But the question simply is, all right, if you have this going down, how much does it go down? How fast? So if you know one day, what is the slope of this curve in the sense of how quickly does it go down? So one day, how much TDN does it lose? Well, basically it loses about half a unit of TDN per day. And that means that if you can't get somebody to cut your hay for about 3 weeks, 20 days, 21 days, you lose 10 units of TDN. That's a huge cut. That's a big, big loss. And that's because of all the lignifications going on, and the plants are trying to go to seed. Now, this curve can go a little bit left, a little bit right, depending on a number of environmental situations, how much rain, how late the spring is, how fertile is the ground, how much stress the plants are, the type of species, et cetera, et cetera. But the basic principle is there. But then if you get aftergrowth, if you get second cut, what you end up getting is a rather different curve. You end up getting, it starts high, but it does lose some as there's some lignification of the forages, but not nearly as fast, which helps explain why second cut and third cut or aftermath hay are almost always better than first cut, because in first cut, you're always struggling with this fast dropping curve against the weather, where in second cut, you got a lot more leeway. Well, how fast does that go off? Well, one day only loses about 1/10 of a unit of TDN, which means 20 days only loses about 2 units of TDN, which is not very much. And you got a long way, a lot of leeway to be able to make hay or graze or whatever else. And you have very high quality forages for a period of time. And this is what you'd like to see. This, by the way, is annual ryegrass with a little bit of plantain right over here. And this would be nice if you had this the entire growing season, but that's not the way things work unless you know how to manage it. So how do we manage the forages? Okay, so here's a standard recommendation, and everyone runs to me to their extension bulletins and whatever else and look, and they say, okay, what's the recommendation? Well, you put the animals in at 8 inches and take them out at 3 inches, or some variation of that depending on the species of, if you've got Kentucky bluegrass and low-growing white clover, it might be 7 to 2 inches. If you got reed canary grass, it's going to be 10 inches in, whatever the case may be. but this is what you're going to see. Put them in a certain height, take them out at a certain height. For example, if you have a, and here's the problem. Here you have, let's take a cow in early lactation if she's raising a calf. Very simple question. How many inches of grass does that cow need to meet her nutrient requirements? How many inches of grass does she need? Probably never heard it phrased that way, because that's not how we balance diets, is it? Because that's what you got. So how can you answer questions like, how long can 10 cows graze a 15-acre paddock? Or how many acres are needed to support 10 cows for 4 days? Those are very, very practical questions. But if you're dealing with inches, you can't possibly answer that. Is there a better way? Is there a better way to even manage the forages before so we can know what's going on before we open the gate? Well, how do we balance an animal's diet? We balance it by weight. In other words, you say, okay, how much does an animal eat? And then that's the package in which you have to put all the nutrients in. Well, that's how we balance a diet. So therefore, we should manage our forages by weight so that we can equate the two. Because right now, the agronomic recommendations and the nutritional recommendations are in different worlds, and they don't match. And by managing forages by weight, we can make them match and answer those questions. For example, let's do it by weight. And the other word for weight is mass, as in a mass of stuff. So total mass. So if we have a total mass of dry matter, and we talk dry matter here, of 3,000 pounds per acre, this is a per acre basis. What are we talking about? How do we measure this? Okay, and also, if you're not in the United States, you're dealing with kilograms and hectares, which is can be a little confusing, but there's a good thing. Pounds per acre, which here in the U.S. we talk about, but if you look at New Zealand, or sometimes in Canada, depends, and in UK, you look at the literature there, they're going to be talking about kilos per hectare. Well, it turns out they're about the same. 1 pound per acre is about 1 kilogram per hectare. It's really 11% difference, but that's close enough. And the end result, well, for your homework assignment, you can go back and figure this out. But in any case, because there's 2.2 pounds per hectare, per acre, it's 2.2 pounds per kilogram, and there's about 2.48 acres per hectare. And you equate them, it's about the same. End result is, let's go back to this 3,000 pounds here. How do we do it? Well, you take a square or close to a square, and you cut down to you want to get the entire mass, so you cut to the ground. Here you are, and then you put it on a postal scale, the weight to the nearest grams, and then you dry it. And ultimately you get the amount of dry matter in that little area here. You think it's 1 foot by 1 foot, but we don't use that. We use 12 by 11.5 inches. And the reason is we use 12 by 11.5 is because that's 138 square inches, and you get a certain number of grams per 138 square inches. And when you equate to pounds per acre, you just multiply by 100. You add 2 zeros. For example, if you weigh this thing and you finally get to about 15 grams of dry forage after you dry the whole thing, and you know it's this, you have 1,500 pounds of forage per acre. Very cool. In any case, back to the main thing. Your total mass is 3,000 pounds. That's the total amount of stuff that's there before you start. Then you go, okay, if you're going to graze it or cut it, you're going to leave some. You're not going to graze it into the ground. Of course, maybe if you have horses, you might, but actually, in a practical sense, there's going to be some what's left over when you pick the animals off that pasture or the equipment off that pasture. Maybe a couple of inches or whatever else, but we talk about it in terms of mass, how much. That's the residual amount of forage. Now, let's say that residual amount is 1,000 pounds an acre, which may be a couple of inches. You don't know that, but it could be 1,000. So you got 3,000 pounds total. You have a residual amount of 1,000, which means the difference is 2,000 pounds. That's the amount of available mass that is available for grazing. So now you have a number you can hang your hat on, if you will. You have 2,000 pounds of feed that animals can eat, which means that, for example, let's do a calculation. Let's go to sheep for this particular example. A flock size of 125 ewes. So you're dealing with 125 ewes. You got an acre of ground. Let's say that's got the 2,000 pounds of available forage, which is what we just calculated. Let's take every ewe is 160 pounds. We're going to estimate that it eats 5% of its body weight. Now, we know that ewes usually won't eat 5% of the body weight, but they do trample some. That's stuff that's going to disappear. They also may have a lamb or two on them, and they're going to be eating after 30, 40 days. They're going to be eating. So we're going to ignore the lambs. We'll just say 5% of the body weight is going to disappear. You can say 4, 4.5, whatever number you want to choose. But the end result, I actually chose 5 because these numbers turn out to be 8 pounds instead of 7.3 or something. So I use that as the round off. But the end result is, if you got one ewe eating 8 pounds a day, 125 ewes are going to graze 1,000 pounds of forage per dry matter a day. We got 2,000 pounds of available forage in there. So if they're eating 1,000 pounds per day, obviously they're going to eat that acre is going to provide 2 days worth of grazing. And if you got 3-acre field, the ewes are okay for 6 days. We can do this before we open the gate. We might be wrong in our guesses, but actually, initially you might be wrong with your guesses, but as you get more experience, you get very good at it. You might not be wrong by very much. So in the end, we can answer questions like how long can something's going to last out in the field? How long is the field going to last, or how many animals can be out there? We have tools in which we can do this. So the thing about it is we have to be able to understand how forages grow so we can actually apply this and maintain high quality forages, or at least know what we're doing. And there are times when we don't want to have high quality forages. You got dry ewes or cows during the middle part of gestation. We can get, or you got some steers that you want to hold it back for a while for whatever reason. There are times when you don't need high quality forages. On the other hand, you need to know how the forages are going to grow. So here we have a graph. On the y-axis, the total amount of forage mass. This is the total amount that's out there per acre. And on the x-axis is the time. So how do forages grow? Do they grow like that? No. Because what this graph says, the way this curve is that they're growing the same speed down here as they are up here. And we know that's not true. Because down here, you only got a little bit of grass, a little bit of forage, a leaf or two out there. And the number of pounds per day they're adding, it can't be very much. There's not many solar panels. You get up here, wow, they've got a whole lot of solar panels that they're adding. And down here, they might be adding 1, 2, 5 pounds a day. Up here, they might be adding 100 pounds a day. So the end result is that this line does not work. So here's a line that does work. Forages do grow like this. Initially, not very fast. But then as they get more and more leaf area, solar panels, they produce more and more carbohydrates. Photosynthesis is kicking in at full speed. You got a lot of solar panels. They're growing really fast. And then they get up here, the top is still growing, it's still functioning, but the leaves underneath are not. They're senescing. Now the total amount of stuff out in the pasture is going up, but it's not going up as fast as it would be in here. And so we take a look at this curve, and you see at least 2 breakpoints, one there, one there. So we do that. Cut them off at the breakpoints, and then give them, and these breakpoints come about 1,000 pounds an acre and about 3,000 pounds an acre. So, and then we can put names on them, and scientists aren't necessarily clever at their names. They're just phases. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So if you have heard situations like where they are, people are saying, well, I'm in phase 2 or I'm in phase 3. This is what they're talking about. Now we can use this because firstly, forages and anything in the pasture that's in phase 1 or phase 2 are high quality feeds. By the time you get up into phase 3, they're starting to mature. Phase 3 can be, you know what a kind of an older hay crop looks like out in the field. That's in phase 3. I won't go through the numbers. You can do it yourself, But the end result is that you get up in phase 3 and you've got an older type of forage out there, which is going to be, if you remember that first graph, is going to be much lower quality, or can be as it progresses into time. So now let's use this and this might be the most important graph I'm going to put up here, is how do you do it? How do you use this? Well, here's good grazing. Here's good grazing that will protect the forages in their most healthy state, and also the most efficient in terms of growth, and that translates to money, and also the nutritional quality. And how do you balance all of those and be able to do a good job? Basically like this: you put your animals into the top of phase 2, into a pasture or grazing cell, whatever you want to call it. Graze, have those animals graze, and then you get to the bottom of phase 2, you take them out. You take them out, you put them to the next grazing cell, and you keep doing that, and you're moving around all over the place. or you put them into a sacrifice area if you have no place to go. The end result is that this is where you're grazing. This is high quality feed. And you say, well, we still got feed down here. It's really high quality down in phase one. That's true, you do. So what happens if you graze down there? Those animals graze down there? Well, now they're in phase one, which is a very inefficient period of growth, right in here. And what happens is, in order for you to be able to get back to that pasture, to put them into that pasture to graze the next time, you have to wait all this time while the plants are getting back up to even to the bottom of phase two, and then they can get up to phase three. And so you have to wait. That could be 7 to 10 days, or even 2 weeks. That you have to wait. You have to add to the cycle. And you do this 2 or 3 times. 3 times in the course of a season, you've lost a month of feed, basically. So you've heard about intensive grazing, which is also called management intensive grazing. Well, people think management intensive grazing is that you move your animals around, and you move them in small areas, and you move them place to place, and that's intensive grazing. No, that's not true. Animals always graze intensively. Cattle, sheep, goats, they always graze intensively. You know, watch them. Now, for example, if you've got a mama cow and she's got a calf by her side, and they're walking across a pasture, and they come to an area in which there is some clover, have you ever seen the mother cow step back and allow the calf to go in first? Not in my world. So the intensive grazing is not it. What management intensive grazing is, it's intensive management. It's a thinking person's way of addressing how to juggle the quality of the feed, the type of feed, the nutritional needs of the animals, and the persistence, healthy persistence of the forage. That's what management intensive grazing. You allocate feed over time very carefully. And there's an extra rule I'm going to throw in here just because those people who know me who are on know that this exists. Basic rule is I call a 5-day rule, which means when you put animals on a pasture, you never want them there more than 5 days. The reason is this, because if you ever sit and watch grass grow, guess how I spend my time, right? I sit there and watch grass grow. But in any case, if you graze something or cut it and it's fertile, how long does it take before those new green shoots start to show up? You know, it starts to regrow. 4 or 5 days. Well, if you have animals in that field during that period of time and they got nothing else to do except walk around looking for feed, what are they going to eat first? They're going to eat that regrowth first. What we want to do in good grazing and to keep a high quality nutrition is no grazing and regrowth. So we have to get them out of there before the regrowth, and by the time the regrowth starts, which, you know, it's 5 days, and some depends on the environment, but 5 days would be a good rule of thumb. Because if you do it, otherwise you're going to select against your best plants, which are trying to come back and they're consistently being eaten off, and this puts them under stress. So all the other jargon about grazing you learn in universities and stuff like that is basically creep grazing, multi-species grazing, forward grazing, high-low grazing. These are terms that you learn in a classroom, but I don't care. I want animals off within 5 days. So here's the rules of intensive grazing, which gives high quality feeds. Number 1, stay in phase 2 growth, which goes back to that curve. Number 2, leave enough residual. Don't eat into phase 1. Number 3, protect the regrowth, which is the 5-day rule. And number 4, which kind of surprises people because they don't think about it necessarily, is that water and minerals move with the livestock. That means the livestock don't go back to the creek, or they don't go back to the barn to get water. They do if you have wolves, of course, but nonetheless, if you end up having, you're moving them around, you got to figure out a way to get water and minerals to move with the livestock. And then you can control what's going on and control the grazing, and then therefore control the nutrition. And there is a pot at the end of the rainbow if you do this. This is a little sidelight. It happens to be a favorite topic of mine, mainly because it makes you smile. How many people have gates on their place? You can raise your hand, right? Okay, we know a lot. So you have gates, and gate latches kind of look like this, don't they? Or some variation of it, or some larger variation of it. You know, okay, this is normal. Everyone's got gates that look like this. Well, the thing about this is, what happens when you open and close the gate? When you go into a pasture and you drive into a pasture, you have to do it 4 times. Once to open it up to get the truck in, then again to close it after the truck is in, and then you do whatever you do in your field, and then you come back out. You got to do it again. Once to open the gate and once to close the gate. Okay. If you have to take 30 seconds each time you have to open and close that gate, you're doing that how many? 2 minutes each time, times how many gates you go through in a day, times how many years. Whoa, there's a better way. This is the better way. It's out of New Zealand. This is a gate latch in which it's got, you cannot open this. An animal can, it looks simple. It's the best design ever made. And it can be opened with one hand. And animals can't do it unless they suddenly evolve having opposite thumbs. Or a coon might, but no cow or sheep can, or horse. And this works very, very well. I've seen this. It's old. I just did a couple of years ago. I went around North Island to New Zealand, drove about 1,800 miles, and probably 95% of all the gates that I saw, and I saw a lot of gates, all had this latch. I have them on my place. A lot of people I work with also have them. One of the nice things about it is that when you have them on your place, you like them. When you go to other places and you go through their gates, you go, oh gosh, I have to do this again. The nice thing about it, when they're on your gate, when they're on your fence, when they're on your gates, every time you go through them, you smile because it's so easy. In any case, there's a couple of places that have them. Jeffers Veterinary Supply has them. Valley Vet has them. Gallagher Fencing has them. They run between, Gallagher's about $12 or $13. And they're a little heavier, and they're a little heavier duty. And the other two, they're about $5. It's kind of to my mind, it's a no-brainer. But I say this because it allows you to do forage management easier. So let's go talk a little bit about some reports. This is the guts of really what we want to deal with, in the sense of, okay, we have to put numbers on the basic, on the principles that we're talking about. So here's a question. I have two feeds, feed A and feed B. Which is a better feed? The TDN, the energy value of feed A and feed B is 56 and 16. Crude protein levels are 13 and 3. Which is a better feed? Everyone's going, okay, this has got to be a trick question. Well, it's not really a trick question. It is what it is. So if you see these numbers, if I say feed A is hay and feed B is milk, obviously there's a problem. The problem is that these numbers here do not reflect the actual nutritional quality of the feed. And why is that? Obviously, milk is going to be better than hay. But what's common to both? They have liquid in them. They have water in them, a certain amount of moisture, or a certain amount of dry matter, flip side of that. So here's how much dry matter is in there. Hay, let's say you got about 11% moisture, which means 89% dry matter. Feed B, milk, it's only got 12.4% dry matter, which actually is about the same amount of dry matter that you can find in early growth grass, which is kind of interesting because you never think of grass about the same level of dry matter as milk, but it is. You can do some testing to see that, which is why you get what is called washy grass in early growth. So you end up having, we have to correct for that. And the way that we do that is you simply take this like 89, make it into a coefficient 0.89, and then divide these numbers by 0.89, divide these numbers here by 0.124, and you end up getting these numbers. The TDN value and the crude protein value, hay being 65% TDN, 15% crude protein, but the milk, 129% TDN and 27% milk of crude protein. Why is this over 100? Is because it's got fat. Fat's got 2.25 more times the amount of energy than carbohydrates. These numbers reflect what it is, which tells us basically how to read a forage test. Because I know Beck is going to be very happy because I'm using Ward Laboratories reports here. And basically, and this is not a farmer or rancher, this is Becca Kern, who is our host. And we have here, it's for fourth cutting alfalfa. And notice that there are two columns. And every lab in the country, every forage lab in the country, feed lab in the country, has this basic layout. There are two columns. They might call one column a little differently than others. This is called analysis as received. It could be as fed, wet basis, whatever the case may be. But the point is there are two columns. The other column is the dry basis. And the main thing is you always, always, always read the dry basis. Did I say that? I mean, I'll repeat it again. You always look at the dry basis column because that's the number that reflects the actual true nutritional value of the feed. And here we got two things in this particular case. Protein is 23%. TDN estimated is, which is estimated because it's a formula. It's not actually measured, but it's a formula based on some other stuff that is measured. Is 58%. So here's a different one. This is a big field first, big round. This is basically a big round bale first cut hay. of grass. Again, there are 2 columns. So you read the dry matter basis column. And I've been in situations where people have simply used these other numbers and said, oh, I got an 8% protein hay. No, you got a 9.4% protein hay. This number is misleading if you use it that way. And then, of course, we have 9.4% protein and 55% TDN. Let's talk a little bit about minerals. Things get really interesting here, and you'll see what happens. A little bit surprising, and some people are going to be rather shocked. Okay, what minerals are needed? Well, there's 2 types of minerals. There's the macro minerals and micro minerals, meaning the amounts that they need. All of these 7 are needed in large amounts, and they're always given as percentages. You know, how much calcium do you need is 0.6% of the dry matter or something of that nature. How much potassium, or how much do you seed in there? You'll see grasses between 1 and 4%. But then the other part is these others are needed: zinc, manganese, iron, cobalt, copper. And copper is needed to those people who have sheep. It is a necessary mineral. It's just potentially toxic at too high levels. These are micro minerals, and they're expressed as parts per million, much lower numbers of. So you might say selenium is needed in half a part per million. So 0.1 part per million, 0.2 parts per million. So that type of thing, or you'll see it on labels. So it's parts per million. The only difference is that there's just the levels. Here's some terminology, and this is a legal terminology. And when we're talking about salt and minerals, the jargon gets really weird depending on who you're talking to. Someone says, "Well, I fed salt, plus I got this blue mineral, and then I'm always feeding minerals." And someone else says, "I just feed minerals," and he says, "No, I do trace minerals," and it gets very confusing. In any case, the end result is the word salt means NaCl, sodium chloride. That's a legal definition. So if you see the word salt on a feed tag or label, that means sodium chloride. Other minerals, there's a bunch of them. Well, interesting. In terms of minerals, do animals have nutritional wisdom? Meaning, if you put a whole bunch of trays out in front of animals, you got magnesium chloride and copper sulfate and manganese sulfate, and you got them all out there. Will animals go and choose which ones they need as they need them in the right amounts? The answer simply is no. There's no data to show that they do. I know there's some people who sell this stuff, but nonetheless, from my point of view as a nutritionist, as a consultant, the answer is no, with maybe 2 exceptions. One very clear exception is salt. Animals will seek out salt. Will they eat too much of it? Usually not, but they can get their whole kidneys are designed to get rid of extra salt through the urine. So as long as they got water, they're fine, but they will seek out salt. The other one is a partial one. I wouldn't call it necessarily scientific, but I know that at certain times of anyone who has to deal with wild turkeys, they can have some nutritional wisdom in the sense that if you have wild turkeys on your place and you ever do any hunting, at certain times of the year, wild turkeys will avoid at all costs. They will avoid lead, but lead's not a nutritional requirement, so I don't worry about it. In any case, we use this concept of salt. We use this concept of salt in a very simple way. Animals will seek out salt. So what we do is we provide the salt and we add all the other stuff with it. Salt is basically the carrot. Animals will they'll like the candy, and they'll come and they'll eat the rest of the stuff, and they'll put up with the rest of the stuff. So we put this whole mixture together. It's called the trace mineral mixture, and that's what we feed, using salt as the driving force. And depending on where you live, there's at least 3 minerals, trace minerals that are needed. Iodine, selenium, and cobalt are needed most at least in the moist areas of the country, places that have lots of rainfall. Out in the range country, that's not true, because there's a lot of these are coming through the plants, and because the pH is very different, and the loss of these nutrients into the lower parts of the soil are very different in dry country. In any case, you'll know locally what it is. And here's another aside. I'm sure those of you who remember what this is the periodic table. This is the type of thing that you read late at night when you have insomnia. But the end result is, I'm sure most people here are fully familiar with this and have memorized it and know this and have always kept it in their mind. No, seriously. There's one point here I want to point out. See selenium? If you might remember that elements in the same column are very similar to each other in some chemical way, well, selenium is right beneath sulfur. Most plants, and certainly all the forages, have no requirement for selenium, but the selenium comes in and is absorbed by the roots, in part because it very much resembles sulfur. So that's why we have selenium in the plants. But the thing about it is, if you put a lot of sulfur fertilizer on, or if you happen to be in an area where there's the volcanic explosion, so you get a lot of sulfur-containing ash, but if there's a lot of sulfur put on, what you can do is you're supplying sulfur to the plants, but you can actually suppress the uptake of selenium. It's just one of those little odd quirks that comes out of the blue when you end up having a problem. But let's talk about an actual thing. Here is a situation in which a couple of years ago on the south coast of Oregon, we ran some experiments. We ran a 2-year experiment in which we had all these different plots, and we used different levels of nitrogen, and we wanted to see growth. These are grass plots. We couldn't add legumes because that would muddy the waters literally if you wanted to study nitrogen. So we were adding different levels of nitrogen. They went from 0, which is the control, up to 800 units per nitrogen in split applications over the course of the season. And we were measuring stuff. Parts of what we measured were the nutrient levels in these grasses. So for example, over time, this was done, we measured over the course of our growing season. In Western Oregon, growing season starts in the fall and ends, in early summer. We don't bury our pipes because it doesn't freeze, the ground doesn't freeze. So we actually get growth in the winter. And so we measured this 6 times over the course of the growing season. We took a look at, in those plots, what the nutrient levels were. So as TDN drops, although it didn't drop as fast as my earlier curve, it still dropped. This was a straight pure perennial ryegrass field, and perennial ryegrass under those conditions maintains some pretty high quality feed. But the end result is, it did drop. Okay, we expected that. Crude protein also dropped over from November to July. So it did drop, and the blue is the actual control, which had no extra nitrogen. Interesting thing here, as you add more nitrogen and fertilizer, the level of crude protein goes up. Not surprising, the plants pick up the extra nitrogen. So, these levels here are extraordinarily high. They're not practical things that anyone would do on any farm, but that was part of the experiment. But what we're really interested in is the minerals levels of these things. So we just take two of these fields, the 0 and the 400 field. So they're right next to each other. There was a little lane between them, but they were next to each other. They weren't very big, but they're really in the same area. So we have the 0 field, if you will, and the 400 field. So this will take a couple of moments to orientate yourself on this one. But we have, on the top, we have the different minerals that we're testing: iron, zinc, copper, manganese, molybdenum, and sulfur. Sulfur is a percent. The rest are all parts per million as a part of a dry matter. And here are the different plots: 0 and 400, 0 and 400. So this would be the zinc 0 part, the zinc 400 plot. And here down on the left side are the different dates, starting in November, January, April, May, June, and July. So here are the course of the season. Let's take a look at the iron. They went from, well, you'll see, 181 was the lowest, 2,600 was the highest, but even within the same plot, let's say take this 400 one here, 315, 2,600, 814, 357, 1,800, and 30, and 810, in the same small area over time. What does that say? And in this case here, just a few yards apart, basically there's 10 times difference between the amount of iron. Now in iron, in case you can pick up a little bit of soil, and yeah, that would explain that. But that type of variation or variability was common in most of the minerals that we were testing. These levels of copper, if you're running sheep and saw these levels of copper in your forage, you freak out. Those are high, potentially toxic, depending on the molybdenum levels. And in here, manganese is less than half. Look at the molybdenum levels go all over the place. In the same plot, This is the difference between 0.3 and 1.2 is 4 times, 400% difference in the same plot over a 6-month period. Sulfur, this level right here would be considered toxic, considering they say 0.4% is your running toxicity, and this is a little higher than that. Well, the point is, so what? The bottom line is this is normal variation, which tells us something. What happens if you take a mineral? Let's say you do a testing of your fields, and let's say in June, and you test all your minerals. They could be all over the map. And what happens if you attempt to put together a mineral mix to match that one testing? Are you going to make it? It's very easy to mislead. You have to make some decisions here. How do we use a forage trace mineral values when we actually are trying to balance the diet and provide good nutrition, mineral nutrition to the animals? Well, you have to be very careful. Don't take a forage, you take a forage sample at one point in time, which is what you do. Those numbers can be all over the map, and there's variation in these minerals that we not only don't control, but we can't predict. Which means at any given time, it could be high, it could be low. And what does that say? Is it real? Well, they're really there for those few weeks. But then what? Now, if you're going to put a mineral mix together based on that, what's going to happen? You might very well put a mineral mix in there that has much too high levels or much too low levels of things that are really just bouncing around. So what I do when I get a forage test, I look for red flags, can keep that in mind. And then what I normally recommend is that people use a general mineral mix that's designed for the area. And, it depends on the area, and everyone's going to be different. That's okay. And make sure, but the thing is, make sure the animals eat it. The biggest problem with minerals usually is that a certain percentage of the flock or herd aren't actually eating it, either because you're also feeding some other salt from somewhere else, or it's placed in such a way that some animals can't get to it, or even within a herd or a flock, there's going to be social levels, and some animals might be shyer and get banged around a little bit and never come back to the mineral mix. So there's going to be those percentages. That's the biggest thing, that animals actually don't eat it, or a certain percentage of animals don't eat it. And those, of course, are the ones that might show up on a veterinary report. So the fact is, just use a good one. And then if there's problems, then you address the problems. So this might be a little different than you've heard before, but this is how I work as a consultant when I work with a lot of different operations, and everything from goats and horses up to dairy and beef, cattle, and sheep. So let's talk a little bit about soil tests. This is Oregon. I live down here in Roseburg. This is Western Oregon. That picture before was out here. That picture out in the middle of Eastern Oregon was out here. In any case, the thing is I work with 3 different groups of ranchers and farmers that we have discussion groups. They're kind of like book clubs that meet every month. And I know I've already seen there's a couple of those folks who are actually in the crowd watching right now. But we've been operating for since 1995 in some cases. The big thing is this: every time we have meetings, we're out in the field, we're doing various things. But one of the things that we always do is we use soil tests. We've had a total, as of this meeting, I've had a total of 674 meetings, and I would say that at least about 2/3 of them have been outdoors, and that means a pasture walk. And during these pasture walks, we always have soil tests. It's not a small deal. Those numbers allow us to understand what's happening, and then we can actually say, okay, what should be done with this field or that field? What shouldn't be done, and how much is it going to cost, and how does it fit into the entire operation, and is it worth it? Or is it worth not doing? And so it becomes a very intelligent discussions using the numbers we have. So let's take a look at a couple of soil tests and show you what we can quickly pull from it. Here's again, Becca sent me a couple of soil tests. This is from Ward Labs. Later on, I've got some forage tests that are not from Ward Labs, and Becca's going to freak out. But the end result is this lab, Ward Labs, it provides soil tests. There's a lot of good information in soil tests. Here's soil pH. That's always important to know. Then there's this other thing here called modified WDRF BPH, which is buffer pH. That is a lookup number. We'll show you how to use that in a moment because it's extremely important. So the real pH of the soil is this one. Then we've got organic matter, and we've got phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sodium. That's important to know because then you know your nutrient levels. And then you got something called the cation exchange capacity, which is the number of binding sites in the soil, if you will, for nutrients. It has to do with how much clay and organic matter primarily is in the soil. And if you're adding biochar, for example, you're going to increase this. So these are important numbers. But the one I want to focus on where you're going to actually make it's really going to cost you money or not cost you money or make a good decision right off the top is this one right here. You want to change the pH, which is your major thing. This pH is 5.2 of this particular soil, which is obviously north of the barn. And you end up having, you want to get it up to 6 or 6.5 or 6.8, just like they told you. And of course, we for good reason. Well, let's take a look at what happens here. Let's remember this. The buffer index, this modified BPH, is 6.3. That's a lookup number. So here's the deal. This happens to be the user guide for Ward, and there's tables for this, and I'll show you two of them. Here's one. Here's table 316, which is the lime. How much lime do you need to raise the pH? That's a very simple thing. If you got a pH of 5.2, how much limestone will it take to raise the pH into like 6.5 or 6.8? In this case, we want to bring the soil up to 6.8. So here's the buffer index. This is that one number. Remember it's 6.3. And this number here, this column here, is the total number of tons of 100 score limestone that it would take. So remember that we had 6.3 was that buffer index. So therefore, we look across to this column here. It would take 2.8 tons of limestone to bring the soil of that field up to a pH of 6.8. It's good to know this before you spend money. It's also good to know is, yeah, I put a ton of lime on. Well, it turns out a ton of lime on may not get you very far. Here's another one of these charts. This chart is actually from Oregon State University. This is the one we use here in Oregon. And they have a there's different names for this SMP lime requirement, buffer index, whatever. There's a couple of different names for the same thing. And here it says, here you got the buffer index on the left side. And here you got, interestingly, instead of just being 6.8, you have different targets, 5.3, 5.6, 6, and 6.4. So this is basically a lookup number. And then we take our 6.3, look across, and I don't want to get up to 6.8. Let's say if I want to get to 6.0, that would be fine, for at least for Western Oregon. If I can get up my soil to a pH of 6.0, I only need 1.5 tons of lime. And I know this before I go and purchase anything. That's a real value of a soil test. You know what's going on, and you know how to use it, and then you know how much it may cost to deal with it. And if you've got 15 or 20 fields, say you're a good size operation, you got a bunch of fields, you can decide which ones you're going to put money in and when you're going to do it. You can do triage, and that's exceptionally important. So when we get together and we talk about stuff, notice they've got things in their hand. Those are soil tests. So we're going to switch gears here and finish up with this thing. Here's a case study where we use reports in a very, very significant way. This is a dairy. We're going to talk about, it's a grass-based dairy farm where an incident happened, a veterinary incident happened, and we had to use reports to resolve that incident. We used, and this is where Becca might freak out because it's not Ward Labs, but this is the lab report. This is the lab that this particular farm used. You won't see that farm's name on this, but nonetheless, this is their report. So give you the basic pattern here. It's a grass-based organic dairy, but it's during the winter. What they do is they feed alfalfa hay. The animals are not on the pastures. The animals being fed alfalfa hay and 7 pounds of grain or something, sometimes 7 or 8 pounds of grain mix. That would be their winter diet. Notice that the crude protein level of that alfalfa hay is almost 23%. It's ADF and NDF, which is the fiber levels are nice and low, which you'd expect and have a good quality alfalfa hay. And here's these numbers right here. This is ethanol soluble CHO, means carbohydrates. Another way of saying sugar. And then starch. So you sugar and starch, the combination of sugar and starch is about 14, 16, 17% in the diet. Sugar and starch is important going into the rumen because those things ferment quickly. So you want to know, these are good from a nutritionist point of view. I can see what's going on here. Also, you got your mineral mixers up here. Here's the minerals. Everything's on a dry basis. So what happened is that the animals went out in the spring, in April, I think it was April, they went out to a young, beautiful, beautiful pasture. It was out there. There was triticale and there was ryegrass, perennial ryegrass, and it was just gorgeous. It was even before the clovers started because the ground was still cool enough. So, but then some things happened. A couple of animals went down. They went out on a young spring pasture, and then a couple of animals went down, and the farmer called the veterinarian. And the veterinarian said, "Oh, young spring pasture, highly fertilized, good fertile, young spring, mostly grass, almost all grass, bingo, magnesium tetany." So he gave them, the veterinarian gave the cows calcium, magnesium gluconate, which is a classic intravenous. The animals kind of recovered and everything seemed good, except the animals didn't really recover. And then a third animal went down. And the animals really weren't recovering. And that's when I got called. I said, okay, what's going on here? First thing I said, if it was magnesium tetany, I'm going to look at the levels of the minerals in that feed. And I want to see what the magnesium level is, and also something called a tetany ratio, which combines the calcium, potassium, and the magnesium into a formula. It's a rule of thumb formula, but if you combine them properly and with the right coefficients, you end up having a number that's called the tetany ratio. And if that tetany ratio, rule of thumb, is over 2.2, then that forage has a high risk of causing magnesium tetany. Well, I took a look at the levels here, and this magnesium level right away is 0.26. And I know that's not a high, that's a pretty high level of magnesium. So why would there be a magnesium tetany problem in a forage with high magnesium? And then I calculated the tetany ratio was only 1.1. Remember, the rule of thumb is 2.2, anything higher than 2.2. So this tetany ratio and the level of magnesium in the feed, in that forage, did not equate to a problem of magnesium tetany. So I looked at the rest of the analysis of this pasture. Well, the ADF and NDF levels were actually quite low, which you'd expect. But this is really low for grass. You do not expect grasses to have a 30% NDF. You expect it at least a little higher, even on young grass. Well, that's pretty weird. Not weird, it's gorgeous, gorgeous forage. But then I look down here, and the total amount of ethanol, sugar, ethanol soluble carbohydrates, this is sugar. These are small, disaccharides, trisaccharides, basically sucrose and other simple sugars. And then starch was basically almost 29%. There was a problem. You had a huge amount of very, very quickly soluble carbohydrates going into the rumen, plus whatever was coming into the grain, which was still being fed. Those animals were suffering from acidosis, not magnesium tetany. So what we did is gave them sodium bicarb as a buffer and put out a tray of sodium bicarb so the animals can just lick it ad lib, just as much as they want, and then be able to, and then increase the amount of fiber in the diet by changing the supplement from a grain supplement to a higher fiber supplement, still maintain the high protein level, and there were no more issues of acidosis that year. The main thing is we were able to use those numbers and figure out what's going on. And I'll finish up with this. I did write 2 books, as Becca had said, From the Feed Trough and Capturing Sunlight. They are on Amazon, and that's shameless merchandising on my part. I don't want to apologize to it, but I won't spend time. You can find it on Amazon. and other places as well. And it's in Kindle if it's in both, trade paperback and Kindle. So at this point, I think we can answer it for any questions if we want to.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. That was very, very informative, and also very fast. So I think those of you that said in the chat, hey, can you repeat this? I didn't quite catch it. We're going to try and address the real questions first, and you guys can go back and look at the webinar when it's posted. But if we have time, we'll get to yours. So the first question was, is 5 days not too long? I believe they're referring to your 5-day rule. A grass will not regrow after 3 days?
Well, it all depends. 5 days is a good rule of thumb. You might see a little bit of growth in 3 days. If someone's working on a dairy animals, they're moved every 12 hours anyway. So it's whatever fits the schedule. Some people go, I can do it every 3 or 4 days. But to put animals out there and say, I'll just leave them out there for, a week or 2 weeks, that's what we call set stocking, or I call set stocking, which is just putting animals out there. Most people think that set stocking is putting animals out there for a couple of months and let them graze into the ground, which is what a lot of people do. Set stocking to me is any time that you're allowing the animals to eat the regrowth. Now the regrowth is highly nutritious, but the ramifications of eating the regrowth are awful in terms of pasture management. 5 days is a good rule of thumb. And basically anyone who's watching this, go out there and look at yourself. Next time you cut grass, next time especially if you cut it so you can actually watch it, or mow your lawn. See how quickly you start to see that little green shoots again. And if you sit there all day and watch it, that's your business. But nonetheless, go out there and take a look. In about 4 or 5 days, you'll start to see green shoots. And from my point of view, from a grazing manager, I do not want my animals to eat that stuff.
Okay, so we have another question, and I think this is more of a clarification. She says, I don't understand why we're talking about putting fertilizer on pasture when we know chemical fertilizers bind up minerals and cause a list of issues working against you.
Well, that's a common belief. It's not true. They don't bind up minerals. The plants don't care which way it is. There are certain things that happen with chemical fertilizers. Yeah, there's some suppression of flavonoids and some other things that go on. Depends on how much. But to shy away, now someone who's doing organic, who's fitting organic is a marketing plan, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And it fits a certain market, and you can't use a whole bunch of things, and you can use other things. No problem there. But the science behind organic is not a scientific classification. It's a marketing issue. And in our forage groups, we have people who are organic and people who are not. And this is discussed all the time. But there's a lot of misinformation out there about what fertilizers will do. Now, fertilizers do some other things and read my book. Fertilizers do a number of things, but they also provide nutrients to the plants. What really causes problems is tillage. Every time you break ground, you destroy the whole root system, the mycorrhiza that's been built up over years, and the ability of plants to absorb things. There's a lot of problems there. But using fertilizer, no, and I'll only say this, grazing does not increase the fertilizer. Grazing changes stuff, it recycles things. Animals eat something, it goes in one end, comes out the other. And it goes in one end as a grass or a forage or something, comes out in concentrated, the nitrogen is concentrated, and it's in organic form that will then break down. But it doesn't add anything. And that's a common, it will change some of the form. When you add some, if that soil is low in potassium, which often it is after it's been hayed for years, because you've just hauled off literally hundreds of pounds of potassium off every acre year after year, well, that potassium's got to come from somewhere to replace it. And if that potassium is too low, there's nothing you're going to do. Those plants aren't going to grow. So we do add fertilizer, but the fact is that there are interactions. Yeah, but not to the extent it's being touted in the organic literature as being, this is the worst thing since in the world. That's not true. Of course, I have no opinions on this type of thing.
Somebody had a follow-up on that. Is it your belief we should fertilize every year?
That depends on your situation. Any other questions?
No, that's
seriously,
kind of what I thought.
Yeah, I was just being facetious. The answer is, it completely depends on what you're trying to grow. Do you have perennials or annuals? Are you taking stuff off? When I say taking stuff, are you making hay and then hauling it away? Are you feeding it back onto the land? Does your soil need it? Yeah, you take a soil test out of a garden, the numbers go often through the roof because people have been putting compost on it forever. All right, that's exactly why you take a soil test, is to find out where the deficiencies are. And when we talk about fertilizer, we're also talking about limestone. Many places around the country are blessed with pHs, natural pHs of 6.5, 7, or in the dry country, 8. Around in Western Oregon, our low 5s would be typical, sometimes even lower than that. So, each situation is different. And then, of course, we can add legumes, and legumes will bring in, if the legumes are fixing nitrogen, they actually bring nitrogen into the system, which is what fixation is all about.
Okay, so you mentioned pH just now, so we'll ask this question. In our area of Western Colorado, irrigated hayfields tend to have pH of 7.8 to 8.1. Is there another way to reduce the pH that does not involve adding sulfur, which is economically expensive?
I'm not sure why you'd want to lower the pH. And I'm actually, in all fairness, I'm not familiar with areas that have pHs of 8. It's a different situation. I can't really give you an intelligent answer to that as to how to lower the pH without using a sulfur compound. I'm afraid that's not my expertise.
That would probably be a good question for one of our soil scientists here at Ward, Dr. Ray or Dr. Nick Ward. Okay, yeah. I have another question here. Are any of your producers direct grazing or haying fall cover crops? Are there nutritional issues with this feed?
Well, firstly, it's really weird for the rest of the country. Our growing season starts in the fall. So our growing season starts in about October and lasts till May or June, early July. It's really, really different than the rest of the United States, that's to say. But I work with, I lived in Wisconsin and I grew up in New York. I mean, I lived in West Virginia, so I'm very, very familiar with it. If you graze something in the fall, and not here in Western Oregon, but on the Pacific Northwest, but in everywhere else where the winter is going to come on, you're basically you're cutting. It often depends on whether you got legumes, which are storing their. Well, firstly, you're dealing with perennials or annuals. If you're dealing with perennials, you're going to try to make it through the winter. You have to. Legumes will tend to store their carbohydrates below in the ground in the roots or some sort of organ that's there. Grasses store theirs in the bottom inch or two up to the crown. And if you graze and damage that, then those plants are not going to have enough reserves come the spring. Another way of some people will use stockpiling, classically with tall fescue, and then you end up having a standing forage going into the late fall and winter, and nothing's wrong with that. So there's different. Again, it depends on what you're trying to do, what the species you're dealing with, what type of winter are you dealing with. Winter in northern Alabama is going to be really different than Minnesota or Oregon. So again, the word is depends, and you get somebody who's relatively local can tell you exactly the best way of doing things. It's not always, if you read my books or read my books, things aren't as simple as the simple rule of thumb. It depends is a really, and that's not a profanity. Things are complicated. And then when you add the overlay of trying to make a business out of it, it makes it even more complicated because sometimes you'll make decisions because it's best for the business, not because it's best for that pasture. So that adds a wrinkle to a lot of things, which is what, as a private consultant, I deal with all the time. Each person or each operation I work with is unique. So what can happen, what can be really, really good on one side of the fence, the neighbor can have a completely different situation with a different result in terms of the best option of what to do. Sometimes, I mean, our universities tend to do research to maximize production. I don't care if it's average daily gain or yield. Fair enough. We take those coefficients and we go, okay, maybe highest level of production isn't the best economically for that particular field, how it fits into the whole enterprise. And we have to, what might be good for that field may not be good for the whole operation. And that's the discussion we do in our discussion groups, which have confidential information because nothing goes outside that, but people are able to weigh different perspectives, and a lot of it's financial as to whether or not something's going to work. That doesn't mean you don't spend money. Of course you spend money. You spend money to make money, but you spend it wisely and based on science. That was a long answer to a question that didn't start that way.
Okay, so another question we have here, it's do fungal systems in the soil extract minerals from rocks to increase soil mineral content?
You're talking about the mycorrhizae, which, well, at least the arbuscular mycorrhizae, which I would suggest everyone read a lot about that because we're just really starting to learn and appreciate what those things do and how we destroy it every time we do the ground tillage, like disking or plowing. But the fungal systems, there's lots of them in there. The one that's the main one that's super important, which about 80% of all plant species have, these are fungi that interact with the root hairs. They actually send parts of the fungus into the cells of the root hairs in a way that is completely symbiotic. And then these fungi send these little mycelium, the little strands, out into the soil. The strands are much, much thinner than the root hairs themselves, which means those strands can get into soil particles, into cracks and things that the root hairs cannot. And they extend the absorptive capacity, plus hugely increase the surface area of absorption, which is where absorption occurs, maybe 8-10 inches away from plants sometimes. And those fungi are very, very important. They can extract certain types of minerals, including nitrogen and phosphorus, bring them back into the roots, and the fungi themselves get things from the plants, the carbohydrates. And I've seen numbers anywhere from 20 to 30% of the carbohydrates made in their leaves actually are feeding the fungi of those plants. Those are very, very important. And of course, that whole three-dimensional structure gets destroyed every time you disc or plow. So the fungi are very important. I forget what the whole thing when you're talking about, they don't increase the amount of, well, let's put it this way. When we take a soil test, we're looking at a kind of a large sample compared to the actual stuff that's going on at the surface of the fungi. So we're kind of using a hammer instead of a scalpel when we're dealing with a soil test. That's nothing wrong with that, but recognize that for example, here's a good example. We have a situation in which we've taken soil tests year after year on a place, and this has happened in one of the forage groups, and the folks, the rancher there, every year or every 2 years took soil tests and showed that the level of phosphorus was low, was really low. So every year they would add some phosphorus every year. And this, for well over 10 years, the soil test did not change, but the yields did. The yields clearly of that forage they went up. So what was happening, you take a soil test that's 6 inches deep, but you're adding phosphorus onto the surface. That phosphorus doesn't get that deep, but the roots knew about it. And since these were perennial pastures, they probably had a good mycorrhizae, robusculum mycorrhizae, and phosphorus is one of the things that fungus picks up. So what we were seeing, what the plants were sensitive to the changes, but we couldn't pick up the changes in the standard analysis that happens. There's nothing wrong with the standard analysis. It's just what's happening at the actual surface of the plants may not be showing up in a number. There's nothing wrong with that. You just have to recognize the limitations of it.
Okay, I have a very specific question here. We have been calving on triticale pastures, free choice grass hay, and salt and mineral supply, daily moves. We seem to have an increase in foot rot and pink eye 60 to 90 days after this. I have heard that the high protein forage at calving could be the problem. Is that possible?
I doubt it, but I think you need to go to a veterinarian and talk to him. High protein forage is usually not an issue about most things, but if you're having a veterinary issue like that and it's not obvious, get a veterinarian involved in that right away, first thing.
Okay, I think one last question, and they've seemed to have stopped trickling in as fast. So how many days would you like to see between grazing on grass? Thoughts on mob grazing versus leaving growth day 4 inches versus mob grazing being chewed to the ground?
You never chew to the ground. Unless, of course, you want to renovate that pasture. You want to renovate the pasture? Yeah. You have your animals, use up all the forage. But now mob grazing does some unusual things. Mob grazing means there's a stocking density of over 200,000 pounds an acre. Also, along with that, usually, if it's done right, it's a long rest period prior to putting the animals on. That's a very, very major part of mob grazing. The question is, how often do you move things? There's a lot of, depends on the species, depends on your environment, depends on when the water is going to come. Do you have irrigation or not? We have learned that over time, okay, I'm just, something here is kind of.
Oh, I'm sharing our next webinar.
Okay, it's just that suddenly I have two screens and the picture that I was looking at now shifted to my right. So now if I look at the picture, I'm not looking at the camera.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's why. Okay. Mob grazing is very high stocking density. You better know what you're doing because you can do a lot of damage if you don't do it right. But if you do it right, there's a lot of good things that happen, but you have to have a long rest period. You have to allow stuff to trample. Having a lot, when you finish mob grazing, if you're doing it right, and we have 1 or 2 places I work with that do that, is there's a lot of trash on the ground. There's a lot of trampled stuff. That's not lost. That's actually because when you finish mob grazing, when you move your animals off a mob grazing cell, there's a lot of stuff. There's carbohydrates that are crushed onto the ground. Sure. There's also a lot of very, very nicely spread manure all over the place. So what you end up having is all that nitrogen and a huge amount of carbon. You probably have a 20 to 1 or 30 to 1 carbon nitrogen ratio. The microbes love that. So, the microbes, that's exactly what you want to do over time. And what we found with good mob grazing is the root systems of those plants are going down 3 times as deep as they used to. In addition, if it's mob grazing and you don't eat to the ground, that means the animals are not eating close to the ground, which means that their parasite may be less. Parasite load may be less. A lot of things are going on with mob grazing, which if in the hands of someone who doesn't know what they're doing, you could destroy the ground really quickly. You can destroy the forages, and what you got left are forages like bent grass that will come up under mob grazing, under extreme stress, and that's not what you want. So there's a lot of simplistic descriptions and concepts floating around. And again, I come down to the world is a more complicated place than you can cover in a Facebook post. So be really careful about that. In my books, again, each of those chapters goes into more detail than you probably want, but they're readable, but that's what those are about, is we get under the hood and look very, very carefully at a particular thing, because it is complicated. And what we're trying to do as farmers and ranchers is, in spite of all that, we're trying to make a business out of it. We're trying to survive, make good decisions, and still have it the economic bottom line, which is in the end the most important thing. And so we use our science and the understanding of this to make good decisions. And my concept is pretty straightforward. The more you know, the more good stuff you know that's scientifically based, the more chances of making good decisions more often. And these numbers out of your lab, for example, Becca, when you end up having reports of soils and reports of forages and feeds, you've got numbers to work with. And based on the science behind all that, you can make decisions. For example, that example I showed, the case study, that person could have lost a whole bunch of cattle. Not to mention, even if they didn't lose them, how much milk would have been lost for weeks of struggling with that had they not had the right numbers.
And look at the constituents you had to look at. That wasn't seen in the TDN or the RFV or the RFQ. That was seen in the nitty gritty, the starch and the ethanol soluble carbs.
With someone who knew what they were doing with those numbers. And that's where you get an expert. Now, I'm not trying to sell my business, but don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to do that. The point is that those numbers gave hints as to what might be really going on. We're interested in the reality, not the latest thing that's been put up on the net. So, and on the internet, one of the issues is people who are strongest and loudest get heard. Well, life is more complicated than that.
Well, we're past 2:15, so I think with that, we really appreciate your talk here. You definitely have gave us plenty to chew on and think about until the next time. So we just want to make sure and thank you once again. We really appreciate that. And thank you to all of you attendees who have tuned in. Please make sure and check out the third webinar in our series. We will have Dr. Jamie Courtier from Neogen. She's going to talk about selecting genetics for your desired phenotype. So talk about the world as a complicated place. We're gonna see some of that with her presentation as well, I believe. So thank you once again, Dr. Lane. We really appreciate that.
My pleasure, Becca. Thank you.
Thanks.